My name is Saliha Dobardzic. I'm with the Global Environment Facility, where I work on climate change adaptation. And as you may know, the Global Environment Facility, amongst its many mandates, also is an operating entity of the financial mechanism of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This role of the GEF was confirmed also last year in Paris. And of course, with this role, there is a responsibility. So finance is basically what we think about, what we are trying to figure out, as many of you here do as well. The trouble with finance for adaptation and adaptation in general is that there are so many unknowns, starting from what is a farmer in Malawi supposed to plant today in terms of fruit trees that will last him or her and that will work for him or her for the next 10 or 15 years. We don't always know answers to those kinds of questions. We don't necessarily know how far away from a beach or a riverfront we can build. We don't know all sorts of questions. When is an unseasonable hurricane potentially hitting an area that wouldn't expect it normally? These kinds of questions are compounded by not knowing where the finance for adaptation is going to come from. Who is going to provide it? What form will it take? And how can it be best used? Fortunately for us, we have an excellent panel today. We have a couple of guests who unfortunately couldn't make it. We received the news at last minute. But still, I'm very pleased to introduce the panel. To my far left, we have James Close, the Director of Climate Change Group at the World Bank, and he brings many years in climate change, green development, infrastructure development, and has worked for the Greater Authority of London, advising them on climate change. And we're very happy to have you here. Next to him, we have Mahamat Assayouti, who is a Senior Climate Change Specialist at the Africa Development Bank, where he manages a portfolio of largely least developed countries' adaptation projects and brings also a huge experience in a very challenging settings in a variety of sectors, which is pretty common for adaptation, as you all know. To his right, we have Orsalia Kalantzopoulus, and Orsalia has had an amazing career and continues to do things that are cutting edge. Right now, Orsalia is the CEO, and please correct me if I'm getting this wrong, CEO and chair of Europa Reinsurance, which is
catastrophe reinsurance company in Switzerland, set up with the help of the World Bank and the Swiss Development Authority, and set up by the countries of Southeast Europe.
Thank you. And next to her, we have Anne Olhoff. Dr. Olhoff heads the Climate Resilient Development Program at UNEP Riso Center and is responsible for the strategic planning and implementation of URC activities on climate change adaptation. In addition to that, she is, very importantly, the lead on the Adaptation Finance Gap Report, which has just been launched yesterday. And with that, I would like to ask Anne to tell us about closing this gap. Are we close?
Well, I don't know if we're close, but first of all, thanks very much for inviting me here to present some of the key findings of the UNEP Adaptation Finance Gap Report that we launched here yesterday. The report has been produced by 25 authors, so I wouldn't consider myself the lead. I'm one of several leads. So 25 authors from 15 different institutions globally, and overseen by a steering committee, and it has also undergone 2 rounds of external review. Maybe does this work so I can move the slide?
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks. So basically, the report provides an assessment based on the latest available literature of the cost of adaptation in developing countries, the finance flowing to adaptation, and the likely difference between the two, which is what we define as the adaptation finance gap. And it does so looking at now and looking towards 2030 and 2050. So what are the key findings of the report in 3 minutes or less? And I'm afraid I won't do the report quite justice, but I see some of the lead authors here, and I'm sure we can provide further detail if you like. So first of all, the report finds that the current estimates of the cost of adaptation in developing countries of between 70 to 100 billion US dollars annually for the period 2010 to 2050 are likely to be underestimates. More specifically, the report finds that for 2030, costs could be in the range of 2 to 3 times that figure, so between 140 to 300 billion US dollars. And by 2050, they could be up to $500 billion. This basically reconfirms the findings of the first UNEP Adaptation Gap Report, and it builds on a more comprehensive and detailed analysis and assessment of the available studies at a global, national, and sector level. What the report emphasizes is really that there is no single estimate of the cost of adaptation. And it also describes in quite some detail some of the reasons behind why these cost estimates vary a lot. And some of the key assumptions underlying and explaining these differences, including the coverage or the differences in coverage between risks and sectors across studies. Also, the assumptions about emission scenarios are very important, and also consideration regarding implementation costs on the ground tend to have important implications for the level and the range of the cost estimates. Turning to adaptation finance, as you all know, there are basically 4 types or sources of finance. We can have international or domestic finance, and we can have private and public finance. And currently, we are only able to track comprehensively international public finance flows, and these are what we focus on in the report. So that also means that the estimates or the numbers in the report underestimate total finance flowing to adaptation in developing countries, since we are not including domestic sources and we're not considering private sector finance either. Private finance, the report goes into a little bit more detail on the scope for private finance, and generally finds that there is a large scope, particularly probably for domestic private finance in addressing the adaptation finance gap. But it's also very, very difficult to track resources, private sector resources. So if we just look in a little bit more detail on the finance that we do actually have significant information about, the international public finance flows, they have increased steadily over the past 5 years and reached about $25 billion US dollars in 2014, of which $22.5 billion went to developing countries. Furthermore, we see that there's a trend of increasing mainstreaming of adaptation into development assistance. And finally, if we look at specifically at dedicated climate funds to adaptation, these are still quite low compared to overall adaptation finance, although they have increased significantly over the past 10 years. And we also see that by the end of 2015, 76% of funds has actually been dispersed. So that's also a sign of growth. So turning to the gap, the adaptation finance gap, what we see is that already today there is likely to be a gap, and here we focus on comparing the estimates of cost of adaptation to the finance that we actually know something about, the international public finance flows. So we basically see how much larger would that flow need to be in order to cover the likely costs. And already today it seems that the funds fall short, or have to be of about a factor of 2 to 3 compared to what they are. We also see that this gap is likely to grow significantly when we look further into the future, even if we consider the commitment under the Paris Agreement of increasing flows from developed to developing countries to $100 billion from 2020 onwards. And if we assume that half of that is going to go to adaptation, there's still going to be a large adaptation finance gap. So, let me just go back. So I guess the $500 billion question then is how we can narrow and potentially bridge the gap. And Saliha, I'm sorry, I don't think I'll be able to answer that, but what seems clear is that actions need to target at least 3 main areas. And the first is to reduce the adaptation needs and thereby also the adaptation costs in general. And one of the key issues here is really to enhance mitigation ambition, because the assessment in the report shows that already by 2030s, costs could depend on emission levels from now on. It also, what is also really important is to continue the issue of mainstreaming climate change adaptation into development planning and implementation, and really to address the current gaps, not only in terms of adaptation, but also in terms of development, because these are going to have a huge impact on the ability of countries to become more climate resilient in the future and to address the gap. Secondly, all sources of finance obviously need to be scaled up. And there's a large role in this for the public sector, not only as a provider of funds, but equally also in setting up conducive frameworks and incentives through policies and regulation, really making countries ready to not only receive funding, but also to absorb it. And finally, across both of these aspects, effectiveness and efficiency are key issues. So it's critical that resources obviously are channeled to where they're needed the most, but also that they are used to really achieve the greatest impact possible. So key issue is, I think also in relation to the discussions here, is that we need to increase country readiness, not only in terms of accessing adaptation finance, but also in terms of being able to absorb it effectively.
Yeah. Thank you, Anne. This is a great introduction, and I think you went over and beyond, and I thank you for that, but I think you have opened Pandora's box, because the question of how to close this adaptation gap is basically now going to be directed to James. So what can we do? What can the world's premier development organizations, such as yourself, your own, do to help close the adaptation finance gap?
Well, thank you very much. I mean, this is really the topic of today, but of our time in many ways. I think what came out of Paris was the importance of adaptation whilst we deal with mitigation at the same time. So, and I think I don't see it just as the World Bank, of course. I see it as us working together in terms of the international development organizations, playing a really vital role in 3 particular areas. The first being using our own direct finance and all instruments that are available to us. As the World Bank, we have our balance sheet. We also have guarantees and through the IFC, private sector finance available as well. So we've got to find the right way to bring that finance together so that we can also mobilize private finance, because the one thing we know is that we're not going to close this gap with development finance alone. The second thing I think we can do is help countries to optimize the way in which they go about this challenge. I think you talked about efficiency and effectiveness of all of this, and I think enabling countries to develop the right kind of policies, and the right kind of institutional capacity and the right kind of planning to deal with adaptation is really a very important part of our role. I think the third thing that we can all collectively do is make sure that we have the adaptation and the adaptation financing agenda front and centre of all the discussions that we have in this kind of arena and elsewhere. We're running up to COP22 in Marrakesh, which is going to be the action COP, the adaptation COP, and the COP for Africa. In many ways, that challenge for us all is to think creatively about how we bring our resources together to do this. I think, we've taken the call from Paris and we've turned it into our climate change action plan, which was approved by our board a month ago. And I think we're making some bold statements around what we're going to do to mobilise finance. So, for example, we plan to quadruple our investment in resilient transport by 2020. We're also committed to increasing leverage from the projects that we have so that we can get the finance to flow more effectively, and we're going to do that by bringing forward better prepared and better financeable or more financeable projects. And we're going to use the instruments that we have to de-risk private investment as well. I think the other area that we need to be really mindful of is how we use this precious concessional finance as effectively as possible. It needs to be a means to an end of crowding in other forms of finance and creating the adaptation pathways that these countries need. We've got a good starting point in as much as we have 51 explicitly identified adaptation projects in 40 countries. We're learning a lot from that, and we're delighted to have colleagues here from Zambia, where we've been working to get information to farmers and smallholders through SMS to help them predict weather and to respond to that in terms of the way in which they look at crop patterns and growing patterns, and also information about water and how water is used. I think we've also got other countries like Mali, which is clearly under great duress, to help them revitalise technologies in agriculture so that they can start to think about how they adapt to the significant changes that they're facing in terms of temperature rise. So, and of course, our IDA fund, the fund for the poorest that we have, is now, we have every project screened for climate change. We're learning a lot from that, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But I think that is one of the major sources of finance as we go forward. And I think making IDA very much oriented towards adaptation is extremely important. And again, we've got some good learning from the work that we've done in Myanmar in dealing with floods, and also in Vanuatu in resilience around agriculture. So I think those are some of the key things that are on our mind. We've also got some really good solutions that the pilot program for climate resilience, which is 25 countries through the climate investment funds, have all done their resilience plans. And I think that shows what you can do as you bring together a broader view of individual projects and you think about it in terms of the economy as a whole, and you look at the interconnectivity between agriculture, water, energy, roads, and other infrastructure and adaptation requirements in countries. So we've done a lot, but I think that's only the beginning. There's a huge amount that we all have to do together to address this challenge.
Do you want to say a few words about risk screening? You mentioned.
Yeah, so the risk screening that we've done across the IDA portfolio has been a bit of a journey, I think, in terms of learning about how to identify the risks, and then how to move from, if you like, thinking about those risks and, if you like, ticking the boxes, to taking those risks and actually designing different types of projects that enable those risks to be managed more effectively. So if I take, for example, Mozambique, we applied the risk screening tool to some of the roads work that we were doing through the IDA lending there. And it was such an obvious improvement in the way that roads were designed that the Ministry of Transport picked it up and used this tool across all their roads in the whole country. So again, I think that's a good example of building capacity and rolling out some of these tools to enable the outcomes to be much better as a result of better designed projects.
Yes, you mentioned scaling up of concessional finance, or actually how concessional finance really needs to be used smartly to scale up and to leverage other sources of finance. I want to ask you to tell us a little bit more about that, but maybe I should direct that question to Mahamat to give him a chance to speak from the Africa context. And the challenges that are associated with scaling up finance.
Okay, thanks, Saliha. And before maybe talking about scaling up, let me tell you maybe a bit of what we're doing in terms of climate change adaptation in Africa. There is a joint MDB report which is published every year, which tells what are the funding from the MDBs which goes to adaptation. And the figures are not very different from the report Anne just published. For example, for the year 2014, the FDB has mobilized almost $2 billion of million USD for climate change. But the issue here, and this is something already known and even flagged by Anne in the report, the part of the climate funding going to adaptation is very little. For example, in the FDB portfolio, we have only 20% of our portfolio going to adaptation, and this is not something we want, because this is driven by the business case of the bank. Because we are country driven, so the ADF fund, which is like the IDA, going to poorest are upon request of the countries, and most of the requests are going for infrastructure, which is more or less, far from adaptation, but we are trying to adapt that. And one of the issues we have also is the ability of countries to understand adaptation, because when we present a project for adaptation, you need to understand what you provide as an activity to make the community resilient to climate change, for example. And this is something we have to work on it, because with the amount of funding now available out there for adaptation, it's a good opportunity for African countries to access to it, but at the same time, they have to build capacity to access to this fund. So, for example, now we have the GCF coming in, we have the JEF, we have been working with them for the LDCF internal adaptation, but most of the case, the projects needs to be identified, assessed with the help of, external entities. And with the climate finance readiness of the program the bank is now piloting, we hope that without the bank, or even without the conventional partners, African countries too can access to this funding without having a burden in terms of capacity. And this has to be a collaborative work between all the partners there. So, for example, you have the issue of absorption, but before absorbing funding, you need to access to it. And for example, most of the infrastructure project we're doing in Africa now, we try to assess the risk of climate change on it. For example, I take an example of project in Togo. This is funded by the LDCF, for example. The bank is doing a coastal road in Togo, but at the same time, we have to assess to what extent the coastal erosion has an impact on this infrastructure. Otherwise, there is no need to go for it. And this kind of screening is very important, because at the end of the day, we are taking adaptation as part of the development, because the linkage between development and adaptation is it's not very clear, and this is something we have to work on it, because at the same time, we as development partners, we want to have people working in a good condition, things like this, but they have to also to integrate the issue of adaptation. And so, Saliha, in terms of scaling up, this is something. It's an important question for an institution like the FDB, because we are requested by African countries to build bigger infrastructure, to do much than than what they have. But at the same time, we have an issue with sustainability, for example. Before scaling up, we need to see to what extent infrastructure are sustained in the countries, for example. And this is something we were keen to consider in the coming, in our coming investment. And let me maybe finish with the issue we have now with the needs in terms of adaptation in African countries, because we have the NDCs, and we have some of the assessment done by the countries, but those needs has to be reflected in their environment. Because, for example, when you have a country which want to build infrastructure, there is a political request from government, from local authorities. But those needs are sometimes very different from the real needs of the communities. And this is something we have to work with countries to put this in our continuous dialogue, because there is a need for development, but there is something, the adaptation is a vital needs. You can build a road, but at the same time you need to take care of your people dying because of food insecurity, because of water shortage. So I think at the end of the day we have to talk with to have a dialogue with countries to see to help them understand what is their need beyond the legitimate need of development, but they have to consider adaptation at the same time. Yeah.
Right. So the awareness essentially need to be raised in order for where it is relevant to develop that understanding that adaptation and development are actually two sides of the same coin, and you cannot do good development if it is going to be sensitive to climate change without taking that climate change into account. And you cannot do adaptation in absence of development. It's impossible. So thank you so much. I still would like to probe a little further. So either back to James, or maybe Orsalia can talk a little bit about untapped sources of finance, how to scale up, what is most promising, and where can we maybe try to go to get this funding that we need to close the gap, at least try to.
Okay. I think our colleagues around the table brought a very broad picture of how the international community and the countries and the local people should try to adapt to this climate change. And the message I heard from all three of them is the solution. One solution is not enough. It has to be a comprehensive effort. It has to involve infrastructure, behavioral changes. It has to change the way that farmers farm their lands, governments the way they behave. Regulation has to change. And the private sector has a role to play. And I've been in this business probably longer than most of you, as I'm quite older than all of you. In '97, when I joined the Caribbean region at the World Bank as the director, I heard that the way the countries were adapting to hurricanes, which was an extreme climatic event, was by growing bananas, because the banana tree, if it is destroyed by a hurricane, within 3 months will produce a crop, which was going to be exported in England for a substantial price, and people will have some money to live. So this was, in everybody's view, a very first attempt to climate adaptation. But this is not enough. The Caribbean countries had tried to bring in the insurance sector and the reinsurance sector in order really to mitigate the physical risks, but most importantly, the financial risk. Every time a hurricane will go through St. Kitts, You will have a natural disaster, but also a financial disaster. And the question was, what can we do to bring the insurance sector in the country? And what we found out, it was we needed to build sea defenses, which is infrastructure. We needed really to introduce and obey building codes, because if the disaster is major, the insurance sector may come in for the first year and pay up, but the second year the premium will become exorbitant. And then people really had to move away from the very high-risk zones. So the World Bank, the team then of the World Bank, which we repeated later on in the Balkans, they started with a very comprehensive hazard mapping of the whole region, where they looked where are the risks, either being climatic risks or earthquake. This is the work that we now have, thanks to GF and to the Swiss authorities, we've been able to do for Southeast Europe and the Caucasus, and now we're moving to Kazakhstan. This has allowed us to provide insurance to the agricultural sector, to households, to municipalities, and we are now working with some sovereign governments in order to be able to secure the resources they put forward for extreme climatic events. And we come a long way to bridging the needs gap financially, provided some prerequisites hold. One of these prerequisites is proper regulation of the industry, so the insurance policy is worth the money that it says it is. Second, that the government or the international community avoid payments to people that they really should not get. I'll give you one very recent example. Northern Serbia was flooded last year. The government paid for reconstruction, and the international community, by the way, the same people that they help our Europa company, they paid for the reconstruction of the houses of the people that they were flooded that did not have insurance. They did not pay for the people that had insurance. Next year, the people that had bought insurance, and they were not a burden to the government, did not buy insurance. And this is the moral hazard, the behavioral change, the responsibility of the government and of the international community. We see similar examples in the insurance of agricultural crops, of what type of agricultural crops people can grow and to be resistant to drought, or the maintenance of irrigation systems that have been built and rebuilt by the international community, but the government or the community fails to maintain. Therefore, the flooding, when it will come next year, will happen again. Now, the insurance industry, would it be us or other private insurance or the big Swiss Re, Hanover Re, and so on and so forth, they may insure and bridge the financial gap the first year. But the second year, either they will charge much higher prices because the losses will be very big, or they will probably even leave completely the country and the sector. So what I would like to bring as a message is there is indeed need of a comprehensive strategy that is multifaceted, that involves the private sector, the government, the individual, the regulatory side, the infrastructure side, the policy side. But this strategy must be implemented. Where I see the major contribution of the insurance sector is it brings the discipline through pricing that this strategy is required to have in order to be implemented. And and the insurance sector can really help to avoid these moral hazard risks that we see repeatedly in the climate change agenda.
Yeah, thank you, Orsalia. That's a very interesting point, the last point that you made about how a major contribution of insurance is basically bringing discipline through risk pricing. Yesterday, Roger Pulrati, I think, said, and please correct me if I'm misquoting him, that insurance should be the last resort. But I interpreted that to mean payout of insurance should ideally be the last resort. But the discipline that you bring in through risk pricing, through other types of measures, through zoning, through codes, all sorts of things that you can do because you know the cost of basically the risk is one very important contribution of the insurance sector. Should we maybe try to think a little bit beyond the insurance sector in terms of what are the other non-public sources of finance that perhaps we should be looking at as well? I would like to invite again the colleagues from the banks to say a few words.
Shall I go first? I think the point about insurance applies, broadly, because in order to manage risk, you need to price risk, and there's no. When you look at private sector finance, there's no shortage of private sector finance. There's a shortage of good projects. And of course, that's a major challenge around a lot of the adaptation activity that we're talking about here. And I think then the question becomes, how do you design the projects? And given that we're operating in a much more uncertain world because of the volatility around temperatures, we have to think about the optionality of infrastructure type projects. So what do you build first, and how do you expand on it? So, do you build a 1 meter seawall with the option of building a further 2 meter seawall if you find that that's required given changes in sea levels? And I think that enables us to think about projects, as you said earlier, resilient development is smart development. That's the premise here. And I think as we look to other sources of finance, we can look to the green bond market. I think that's a very interesting area where, as many of you know, the bank has kind of pioneered some of that work, and I think there's about $9 billion of green bonds issued by the bank, and a further $4 billion issued by AFC. And that money is looking for good projects to associate itself with. So you get the mix of the supply of finance from pension funds and long-term capital that's looking for a long-term home, and sustainably responsible investors, which are becoming more and more, and you then connect that to these green, which could be low carbon, adaptation oriented projects, and by doing that you can get the money to flow in a different way. And I think we've got experience of about $3 billion of that money has flowed explicitly into development projects around the resilience associated with water, agriculture, and transport. And my sense is that there's even more untapped potential there, both in terms of the supply of that money and also as we think about building the optionality and the resilience around these kind of projects. And you know, examples in Indonesia, I think, around using green bonds to associate itself with agricultural adaptation is a good example, and that I think has benefited about 500,000 households there. And also in Belize, in terms of rehabilitating flooding. I mean, that's another good example of a project that has enabled bridges to be redesigned so that they can respond to different flooding patterns. So that's, I think, the whole green bond market, and you know, there's a lot to be said there and a lot more to be done. And I think, you know, we can move beyond the multilateral development banks issuing of green bonds. We're seeing a much more vibrant market of players coming in there, including private sector companies and corporations. I think the other area that's really interesting is the debt for resilience swap. I know there's been quite a lot of talk about that, both in Jamaica and also in the Seychelles. And this is an opportunity where I think the development community can help developing countries swap high-cost debt for lower-cost debt and link that to resilience projects. And I think we can build physical resilience and then also fiscal resilience. And if we get the two of those coming together, the long-term future of these countries is strengthened quite considerably. Then I think that the third area to look at is the private sector area. And I think, you know, one example there is the Africa Climate Business Plan that was launched in Paris. And I think this is a really good platform that enables projects to be presented and then opportunity for that finance to flow, whether it's from multilateral development banks or whether it's from other parties. But I think across the Africa Climate Business Plan, which aims to raise 16 billion, 3.5 billion of that is targeted at the private sector. So making those projects private sector investable is really important, and that can, you know, work for sub-Saharan Africa, and of course that sort of increases the creditworthiness and the institutional capacity of those countries as well, as they deepen and broaden the markets in which they can access finance. So I think there's quite a few convergent ways of bringing different forms of finance to solve this conundrum.
Yes, and I think a number of them seem quite promising for even the least developing countries. But let me turn to Mahamat and see, what do you think of some of these solutions, or are there other solutions that the Africa Development Bank is thinking of in terms of going forward and exploring perhaps untapped opportunities?
Sure. You know, I mean, during the Paris COP, we have all of us made commitment, right? I mean, to see how we achieve the adaptation needs for the continent. And I mean, the FDB has made a commitment to increase the finance to adaptation by additional 5 billion every year until 2020. So this is, I mean, a huge amount, and we are not expecting to mobilize this alone. I mean, it should be part of a partnership between all the MDBs and all the private sector and all the sources out there. But I mean, for now, what we have been doing is just to look at our internal resources and see how we can leverage on that to achieve some development in the continent. But now, given this new need of adaptation, we need to think, I mean, a bit more smarter to see how we can access to other, I mean, type of funding. So, for example, let me take an example of a project we have funded actually with the GEF, which is the trust fund. It's supposed to be mitigation, but then it turned out to be an adaptation because of the benefits. It's an agroforestry project, I mean, in Africa, and everybody, I mean, is awarded agroforestry contribute to food security, in particular in the dry line area. And this transaction is a private sector funded transaction, actually. We have been able to mobilize concessional funding from the GEF to attract other type of investor, which are private, completely private. I mean, they could not be interested by a transaction if we put it as, an agriculture project like this. But we have provided to them an incentive telling them you can develop an agroforestry project in the Sahel region, contributing to food security, but then you have a market there. I mean, the whole region is about 18 countries, so they can be completely, profitable for you. So, and this transaction initially was supposed to be a $5 million USD only private equity fund, but then with this, mechanism of concessional funding, the final private equity, total amount is around 65 million now. So this is example of how we can attract private sector in adaptation. The second solution, we are now testing in the bank is to propose a partial risk guarantee to private sector, for example. One of the issue for the private sector in Africa is that they see risk everywhere. I mean, when you propose to them, an operation, they want to have, sovereign guarantee. They want to see, cash reserve. They want to see. So the mitigation of the risk is so difficult for an African country because at the end of the day, he could put the same amount requested by the private sector as a guarantee than investing in his transaction. So now we trying to propose to African countries to use part of their country allocation with the ADF as part of the private sector operation, so they can have a leverage on the allocation they have to as a member country of the bank to develop some adaptation project for their country. And here the advantage is for the private sector to be in the market, and for the African country to attract people, investor to for example food security, develop a smart agriculture project in one of the risky countries. For example, let's take example of Chad, for example. The country is very highly risky, ranked. But if they put the partial risk guarantee, then they can have access to other funding of, instead of using their own resource. And the last example we have is the way to for African countries to promote, other access funding modalities. For example, in Africa, and this is valid for most of the country, you have some local authorities, like what we call municipalities. They have, very financial profiled, and they can be able to borrow money without going through their, the normal system of finance in the country, going through Minister of Finance and things like this. And these municipalities, sometimes they are not in the urban area, they are in the very rural areas. And they don't have access to public funding because, of the distribution of the funding in the country. But at the same time, they are able to borrow money because they have, income generated by the local taxes, but they don't have capacity to do that because they are not well ranked, they don't have AAA, they don't have. So now is our idea is to see how we can strengthen these local municipalities to access to other source of funding than public funding. And this is something which can be, the fund they can mobilize can be used for adaptation project without any issue. Because at the end of the day, the municipality is the one who respond, who refund, but the project, can benefit for local authority, entity or any other type of thing. So those are kind of ideas we are trying to develop in the bank.
Yeah. No, that's also very interesting, and it brings me to a question I had meant to ask. Basically, just the last example you show makes me question, is it really, are the solutions we're developing in the developed world and in the middle-income countries, are they transferable actually? Do they apply to LDCs necessarily?
Well, the last example I gave is more in LDC rather than developed countries, because in most of developed countries, municipalities are completely, independent. They can borrow money, they can access to financial market. But, for example, in the LDCs, it's almost impossible for them. Let's take an example of, Niger, for example. The municipality of Niamey cannot have access to any kind of funding other than public funding. But if we strengthen them, if we help them to be, financially sufficient, they can have access to regional markets, for example. They have access to the West African market. And this is something and this is not far from the bond issuance, because these municipalities, if they are really, well structured, they can issue bonds. Green bonds, they can issue anything of thing. And I think this is something we have to promote. Local authorities has to be, part of the solution. We cannot just talk about, countries. And in most of the cases, the people facing the issues are not, people sitting at the capital, because, sometimes food insecurity in a country happen in completely remote area, while in the capital, they don't see things like this. And the local authority, the guy who is sitting, the mayor, he needs to respond to those issues. And if we give him another solution, then he can maybe be more proactive, more dynamic.
Right. It's just that to the point you mentioned about creditworthiness and essentially developing, getting to that stage, it requires what looks to me like a really high, overcoming a really high curve, capacity building curve. And maybe that's the only way to go about, but I'm just wondering, is that really feasible? Any thoughts on that? Orsalia, maybe from your experience on insurance, because you have been involved in developing quite specialized products, and this is, of course, middle-income countries. So I'm just curious whether you think this can even work in LDCs.
Oh, I think it can. Microinsurance can work in LDCs, but again, it has to be for the right. One has to look at the right crop and the right risks, and indeed, one size does not fit all. We are trying right now in Macedonia, in former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, an insurance scheme for microinsurance through their telephones, which could very well be replicable in all over Africa or other developing countries. We, together with a local partner, provided through the telephone lines, basically. These similar schemes have been introduced in Africa, from what I understand, with quite a lot of success. The amount of coverage is fairly small, but for when we look at ourselves, what it will cover, but it will be a very good, it is a sizable response for the level of income in the country. This is, it's something that is it's not fully developed yet,
it's work in progress.
But it's work in progress. Similarly, after we do the hazard mapping that we need to do in Kazakhstan, which is the latest country where we're engaging, we will probably be insuring the agricultural sector. And in this case, some of the marginal producers that should not really be in the agricultural sector, and where the losses every year are huge and they have to be paid by the government, we will probably be, there will be some structural changes in the economy, but through a viable insurance scheme, this transition can become much easier.
Thank you so much. It's been an interesting discussion on the last minutes or so on different ways of scaling up and leveraging the private sector. Before we turn it over to the audience for some questions, I just want to ask one last question, and this is to all and no one in particular, what are those sectors or areas or problems where public finance is still indispensable in your view?
Well, I mean, I think just to sort of frame that, first of all, I think the long-term solution around all of this is to make sure that we have an integrated approach to dealing with adaptation, and that we think about this as, not just a sectoral problem, but actually a multi-sectoral solution. And that, I think, requires long-term planning to do that. Of course, the long-term planning, is the benefit of that is institutional and capacity building, which sort of starts to enable countries to get onto development pathways around longer-term growth. But to support that, you need information, you need data, and you need examples of best practices. So I think if you take, for example, delta management, there's lessons to be learnt from developed economies. I mean, indeed, the Netherlands, in terms of the way they've managed water and water systems and how that can be applied to deltas. But I think in that example, the water side of things lends itself to public funding around it. The agriculture, you can see private sector solutions and private sector participation in that. Transport, again, you really have to, unless you can put together good PPPs or find ways of doing that, again, you need significant public sector support. So, I think, and the final thing I'd say around this is, we've got to drive innovation into this as well. And I think as we start to see the market formation and entrepreneurial activity in some of these countries, we're seeing it with the climate investment centres that exist in Kenya and Morocco and several other countries. That brings that entrepreneurial spirit to develop these solutions. And if you can support that with some private sector funding, you can catalyse some public sector funding, you can catalyse the private sector funding, and you can build that entrepreneurial activity.
Great. Anyone else want to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, so far we have been intervening in different countries, responding to different needs. And now this issue of adaptation goes beyond, the normal, way to do things. We cannot just do an agriculture project in a country by expecting this country to be, adaptive to climate change, because then, the countries has maybe the same issue in different area, in different, part of the country. Then I believe that we have to spend more resource and time on helping countries to access to climate finance. For example, most of the countries have the same counterpart. They are talking to the World Bank, they are talking to the FDB, they are talking to private sector, but they put these requests, in a way that doesn't help them to coordinate. They have to be able to put their budget profile according to what is available out there. And now with the GCF coming there out, and with the increasing role of the private sector in the climate change and more for adaptation, countries need to be able to access those funding. And this goes through support in terms of climate finance readiness. And as an FDB expert, I don't believe right now that African countries have abilities to access to climate finance right now. They still rely on FDB, World Bank, and other intermediaries, and this is not a way to be. This doesn't help them to access to a big volume of funding. I think we need to help them to first of all, to identify their needs in terms of adaptation, and then how to access to the resource out there. And this is not well deserved, I think.
Anyone else wish to weigh in?
Yes, maybe just as James also mentioned, I mean, overall the government and public sector has an important role in setting the overall institutional, legal and policy frameworks. But I think it's also important to realize that even though there is a very large potential role for the private sector, there are also limits to the scope for private sector involvement. And the more we are moving into areas where the issues of a public good nature, so for instance ecosystems as an example of a sector providing public goods, and the more we're considering very long-term sort of investments or benefits of interventions, generally the less the incentive will be for the private sector to invest, and those are really the areas where we need public sector interventions.
Orsalia, do you have any remarks before we...
Well, I think the private sector can bring some discipline into the whole area. However, it is really very clearly the role of the public sector in order to regulate and look at where the risks and the opportunities are. However, the private sector, if it is properly engaged and properly regulated, and I should really underline this, because the insurance industry sometimes tends to be not properly regulated, they can really forge a partnership that could bring about it could be a Pareto superior, as we say in economics. It could really bring great gains.
Okay. Are you sure? Yes. All right, we have 1, 2, 3 here. How many on that side? Wow. Wow. Okay. All right. Let's start with you, sir.
My name is Radat Mechler-Yasa. So the discussion has been mostly about scaling up, but when looking at the numbers, so it seems of the 22.5 billion going to developing countries, 50% is concessional, 20% is market-based, only the rest is grants. So I just wonder, isn't there scope for like revamping or like thinking about increasing the share of concessional lending or increasing also the share of grants? I missed that in the debate a little bit. Thanks.
My question is more on the co-benefit kind of idea. It's either not the adaptation or the mitigation. So what I like to put a sort of question to the panel is that maybe there are ways, we can kind of maximize the synergy between mitigation and adaptation. So that I think in terms of mobilizing finance, so that might be kind of a little easy way for us to go. Either, just talking either black and white, either mitigation or adaptation. So I just would like to have a panel's view on that.
Hello, my name is Tim Schreiber from C40, and just in my last job I worked on energy finance in Madagascar, and I had the same question about some of the solutions presented, whether they are really feasible. And I don't know if local authorities have the capacities to access finance, because for a lot of international donors, corruption is still such a big problem that it poses so many challenges that the financial flows often just stop. So we had this case in Madagascar where a lot of UN money had just vanished like a few years ago, and ever since there were just no grants, no public finance anymore in the specific sector of renewable energies. So I wonder what kind of solutions you can think of in tackling corruption while developing the countries and increasing finance flows.
Wow.
Good evening. I'm Suri Babu, representing National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development from India. When it comes to financing of adaptation projects, there will be too many questions. But for a change, I'm not going to ask a question, but I would like to share some experiences of us as a I mean, we are the national implementing entity for two international funding sources, that is the Adaptation Fund and also Green Climate Fund. This about our government of India has also constituted one exclusive fund for adaptation, supporting adaptation activity. To begin with, is about $50 million US, and that is a open-ended fund. Well, we are acting as a converging point for resources. The point I would like to mention here is that when we look at macro level, yes, there should be some converging point for mobilizing the resources. But when we look down at the micro level, especially at the project level, well, there can be a very good convergence of funding sources. I'll just quote an example of one project which we are working out with one of the state governments there, where we are looking at funding from, state government is willing to support almost 40% of the project cost. It's about 250 million cost. And also they are planning to borrow from IFAD and of course from GCF. So, and more importantly, a farmer also can contribute his own stake into it. In the sense that it could be 5% or 10%. But the thing is, once a farmer is contributing his stake, he will be feeling that his ownership of the project and not on the receiving or as a charity. He is not. He never gets a feeling that he is receiving some charity. Mm-hmm. He feels that he is also one of the investors. And also corporate sectors, yes, we are also looking at an option of involving the corporates or the private sector either through their CSR, that is corporate social responsibility, or as part of, because many of the corporate sectors who are in the agro-industry sector, it is their supply chain. Agriculture is their supply source of supply chain, and perhaps they have their own interests. I mean, like this, we are trying to converge the resources to fund these adaptation projects.
Mm-hmm. And actually, I think when we talk about leveraging private finance, most cases it is household or individual private finance. So that's a very relevant point, and it doesn't get emphasized enough. Let's take one more question from this side, and then we turn it over to the panel. I did give you a mic, so please go ahead, and we'll take one more question from this side. Because this side got a lot of questions, but you go ahead.
My name is Tasila Banda. I'm from Zambia, the Ministry of Finance. And I just wanted to comment on what AFDB talked about, the lack of coordination when countries are trying to get funding on different climate change-related activities within the country. Zambia, of course, we are not an exception. We are in the middle of experiencing this lack of coordination. But it's been helped a lot with the PPCR program, where a secretariat was formed, and we are able to encourage people from different ministries to use this system to leverage more funding even for themselves. It's difficult, I think, on the ground, because everybody, if you are the Ministry of Water and Development, you want to just go to the World Bank or to the African Development Bank and ask for that funding. But as the Secretariat, we try to help them see the benefit of coordination. Mm-hmm. That's my contribution on that one. I also have a question for you. And this is, it's clear that adaptation projects are very difficult to define compared to the mitigation ones. And it's a problem, I think, for developing countries. What is the bank doing to help countries define these adaptation projects, and how do we move forward? Because now we are at the stage where we need to act. So how are we going to act, us in least developed countries, on adaptation activities?
Last question.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for your comments. Interested in your ideas for what the Green Climate Fund can do as a new funding source coming out of the UNFCCC process for the very purpose of helping scale up funding for adaptation, given that 50% of its funding, which is currently about 10.3 billion, should go to adaptation, and the African Development Bank and World Bank are accredited entities to the GCF, so interested in their ideas on how they can best leverage it too.
Okay, so because we have quite a few questions, how about we try to address them in bulk, and maybe each of the panelists can chip away at the aggregate, shall we put it that way? Would you like to start,
Do you want me to
James?
start? Thank you. Okay, so let me try and draw some themes out of what I think are some really great comments and observations around all of this. And I think if we start off at the, what kind of finance do we need to use for what kind of intervention, so that we think about grant finance, concessional finance, less concessional finance, and private sector finance. I think this is an art rather than a science, in as much as we need to understand what can unlock what in all of this. And I think the GEF funding has been phenomenally helpful in a whole series of areas in terms of unlocking concessional finance and then actually moving towards even slightly less concessional finance in a way that's really quite productive. And I think that links to the whole GCF point, and how are we going to see the GCF evolve around this? And I think our request would be that the GCF starts to think very programmatically about the work that it does, so that we can learn from one place and apply it into another place in a way that really moves the needle around all of these particular issues. I think, and I think that also lends itself to this opportunity to identify synergies between adaptation and mitigation. And I think, the water, energy, food nexus is a really important part of all of that. How do we get the right kind of trade-offs between, thirsty energy and irrigation and food, and how do we design systems that bring together the adaptation and mitigation parts of the solution? So I think that's a really relevant question. I think we've got to look for some good case studies that give us examples of how to deal with that. Maybe just a final comment on the point around corruption. I mean, I think, perhaps to the insurance point, we're seeing some really interesting solutions starting to develop where smallholders are able to use mobile banking to pay their insurance premium, to get the weather data that tells them whether to plant their crops early or late, depending on what the expectations are about that weather, to then post-event to be alerted to the fact that that event's happened or is about to happen, and then to make a claim, all in a relatively contained financial flow, which I think cuts out some of the potential for corruption, and I think that's a great opportunity as well. And I think just the final word around all of those questions is, country coordination in the country is so important around all of this. And I think that's certainly one of the lessons that we've learned from the PPCR, is that you get significantly better outcomes when activity is coordinated and ministries talk to each other, and we leverage, the multi-sector plan concept to take really good scale development solutions around adaptation.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, maybe on the co-benefit, I think this is one of the solutions we see how we can mobilize more funding for adaptation by providing mitigation project. The relation between mitigation and adaptation in some of the projects are completely linked. When you do a solar PV project in a small village, you can easily use this power to do irrigation for agriculture. And this is something we have many examples in our portfolio, and we believe that this is a way, for example, to stop this fighting between mitigation and adaptation. And this is something I believe can be replicated in different continents, different. And as you know, adaptation right now is not well funded, and this is for many reasons. And at the bank, we try to put forward the idea of, for countries when they access to the ADF allocation, to promote adaptation by, for example, doing an infrastructure project. For example, when they do a coastal road, they can easily protect the road, to avoid population, being in a difficult situation if the erosion, continue. So I think I'm completely, I agree with you that this is something we have to pursue. How AFDB help, countries to define adaptation? I think this is a very difficult question. I mean, adaptation and development is so linked that it's very difficult to differentiate between the two. But what we have now in the bank, we have a small fund called Africa Climate Change Fund. This is a very small fund of 5 million euro funded by the Germany, and the objective of this fund is to help African countries to be able to access to climate finance. But part of this fund is dedicated to capacity building for countries to identify their needs in terms of adaptation. I mean, we don't. The NDCs are completely. Well, because most of the countries, they understand what they have put it in the NDCs, but then how to move from the NDCs to projects, and this is where we help them through this. There are small grants, but basically we are putting in place some awareness activities, some small technical assistance there to see how they can integrate climate change, but more adaptation in their development strategies and so on and so on. And maybe I will, the relation between GCF, how AFDB can access funding from GCF, since we just got our accreditation, last year. Right now we are trying to understand how we can be of best leverage from, GCF, because the pledge and the commitment from the GCF are enormous. They are even beyond what we have been doing in a year basis, for the last years. And we believe that this flow of funding has to be used in a way that we continue doing our development objective for the continent, but also we use this GCF funding for the benefit of the African countries. For example, mitigation, this is obvious. For the mitigation, there is no difficulty to define that one. But on the adaptation, we are working on a pipeline of projects in the bank now, and we are in discussion with the GCF to see how we implement this, because, as you know, we have not yet submitted a project there, but we believe that the GCF funding should be part of our normal investment in the country. We believe that we have enough capacity to implement projects in Africa, and the nature of the fund from GCF has to benefit from what we have learned for the last 50 years working in Africa. So we see the GCF as an important leverage for our future work, in terms of adaptation and mitigation.
Thank you, Mahamat. We are actually running low on time, and I wanted to give the opportunity to our two other panelists if they wish to offer any last remarks.
Yeah, on the adaptation, if I may just say, the price mechanism we have to make sure that the price mechanism or the insurance sector tries to work. Because what we see, for example, is that people live on floodplains, or they continue to grow crops that are not resistant to droughts or to the various irrigation systems are not properly maintained, and so on and so forth. These are the areas where the insurance sector, because at the end of the day they look at the bottom line, they can really help to bring about change and to adapt on the climate side. What we see, however, is a bit of the contrary. The governments, in order to keep their voters happy and so on and so forth, they continue to give what, in my view, are direct subsidies, to grow a crop that no longer should be grown in an area that is now prone to extreme weather events, or people to live in plains, in floodplains. We have the very clear example of the United States and the Mississippi River, and where FINMA comes to the rescue every year, a public insurance sector. So I think hopefully this agenda and the climate change agenda can bring some discipline where it really should start, which is the use of financial resources and incentives these financial resources provide.
And maybe just to add, I think the question related to synergies between mitigation and adaptation and funding for those, I think that's quite interesting. And it's an area where I think we actually learned a lot from the INDCs developed by countries last year, where we saw a much more holistic approach in general than what has typically been the case with the pillars, the very sort of pillar structure around issues and also funding. So I think, you know, countries can actually help break down some of these pillars and the watertight proofs between the different areas, and also it fits into a larger context of also seeing the whole climate change mitigation and adaptation challenges in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals and sustainable development. So I think it's really interesting if we can move towards a less sort of narrow view of the different issues and a more integrated approach. And that's also where the funding institutions have a very large role to play, because obviously they've provided funding for very specific purposes for very good reasons, but they're not conducive to a more holistic approach. So I think that's a really interesting topic and an area of discussion to take up. On the issue of the grants element and concessional loan element, I think that's also very relevant in terms of our discussion, because again, it's a key question. Not only do we reach the most vulnerable countries, but do we really reach the most vulnerable populations and the issues at the community level through these issues and solutions that we have been discussing, and also relating to the questions asked by the gentleman from the C40. Are these solutions really feasible? And I think some of the issues that came out here were quite, you know, if we really want to reach individuals and households, we need to think broader than what we've been focusing mostly on here, and think in terms of very innovative solutions. And I think some of the examples that you also mentioned, James and Mahamat, with the whole mobile, how much you can use mobile technology for instance, I think some of these solutions are not going to come from us. A lot of them will come from the bottom up, and we already see a lot of the solutions that really make a difference to people in the communities who are the most vulnerable.
Thank you very much. I think we are at the end of the session. Before we close, I would like to thank my colleague from WRI, Athena, over there, who has helped organize this panel. We've heard many interesting thoughts and ideas at this panel, and I think it would be extremely difficult to summarize them all. And since we're at the end of the session, I will not. So just please join me. Please join me in thanking the panelists. And thank you all for coming as well.